Welcome to the Human Services Council. HSC is the way that nonprofit human service providers can work together to advocate for the sector and for the clients they serve. This webinar is a project of HSC's Disaster Readiness and Resiliency Initiative, funded in part by the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. To ensure that after a disaster, organizations can both help those impacted and continue to fulfill their normal functions, HSC helps organizations prepare for emergencies. This webinar continues a multi-part training. First, there was a self-study webinar, which provided an introduction to the group webinar held on April 7th. If you did not watch the self-study webinar and the group webinar, you should go to these URLs on the YouTube website where you can view both before viewing this one that we're doing now. This self-study webinar will focus on two topics: a general introduction to the role of human services organizations in disaster, and the emergency action plan as part of your overall emergency plan. There is one further self-study webinar for you to view before our next group webinar on April 20th. After that session, a final self-study webinar will close out the training. So let's get started. I'm Haim Obadia, and I'm the presenter for this webinar. Jason Wu and Jennifer Diamond are managing the technology and logistics. Although a practical, effective emergency plan needs to be written specifically for your organization, it's helpful to have some general understanding of the role of human services after disaster. Paradoxically, to explain the role of nonprofits, I need to begin with the role of government. There's an important principle in emergency planning: all disasters are local. Generally speaking, local government is first on the scene of a disaster. It's the first provider of services. If the disaster response requires resources that exceed those of the local government, it turns to the state for additional resources. And the state is also a conduit to the federal government, so that if the needs exceed the state's resources, federal resources can be brought to bear. This is called the sequence of service. As you might imagine, there's an additional complication for us. New York City often operates as if it were a state on its own. Many resources that in other parts of the state are managed by state agencies are handled in New York City by city agencies. However, what's important for you to know in your own planning is that the federal government does not care about that. It will apply resources through the state as it does everywhere else. This requires an uncommon degree of cooperation between New York State and New York City. When disaster recovery is well underway, the federal government will begin to withdraw its resources as the needs are more manageable. Likewise, over time, the state too will withdraw, leaving the recovery to the local government. So as you see, the sequence is just the opposite of how resources were originally applied. So finally, the local government that was the first provider is now the last provider. And throughout the process, human services organizations are also involved. And it's particularly important to note that after a disaster, there will be resources from government and from nonprofits with disaster-related missions to help people recover from the disaster. But eventually, people with long-term needs will need help from the community's existing nonprofit human services. And in some cases, that might require organizations to make changes in the services they provide. This is especially important because we know that vulnerable populations are also more vulnerable to disaster impact. There will be disproportionate impact on marginalized populations. This is an illustration of the disaster cycle. There are a number of ways to portray it. So if you look for other examples, they may differ in the number or the names of the parts. But in particular, I want to emphasize that these phases are not really well-bounded, distinct stages that come to an orderly end before the next stage begins. They overlap, they meld into each other. In short, see this diagram as an ideal picture, not as a reflection of reality. An event happens, and immediately people begin to respond. At this stage, the focus is ensuring people's safety and meeting immediate human needs. You see here the kinds of things that are made priorities in this phase. And you see here some scenes of what that looks like in real life. Human Services Council also has a role after disaster, and you may already be familiar with the work it does in response to COVID-19. HSC is not a service provider, so you won't see the staff handing out water or bandages. What HSC is doing is critical work on behalf of the sector as a whole. Two examples of their advocacy work are the city's acknowledgement of human services organizations as providing, quote, essential services, end quote, and its agreement to ensure that our organizations will be protected from a loss of revenue on their contracts with city agencies at this time. Often, when the response phase is still operating, there also begins the recovery phase. In this phase, the priorities are longer-term needs, like housing, employment, etc., all in the interest of helping people impacted by the disaster. So the scenes here reflect different priorities. The goal of recovery is to help people return to a life that is relatively stable, i.e., not in current crisis, and more normal. Notice that the word normal is in quotation marks. This is because helping professionals in disaster recovery know that the goal of recovery for a client must be normal for that client, not normal according to some theory or normal according to what the case manager thinks is normal. And the goal is for life to be more normal. We recognize that many people impacted by disaster will not go back to a life just like before. There is never a guarantee that anyone will be made whole. We've spoken already about people who will be disproportionately impacted, and who will be put into even more tenuous circumstances by disaster. But even those who are relatively fortunate may suffer impact that changes their life forever. In the mitigation phase, we consider the lessons learned from the event and from the experience gained in response and recovery phases. As a result, we take action that will make our community less vulnerable to hazards in the future. This might be raising houses to reduce flooding, retrofitting buildings to resist earthquake, building seawalls, etc. And that brings us back to readiness. All the things that we do to prepare. That's what readiness is, including the writing of emergency plans for all kinds of hazards, not just COVID-19 and not just Jovian attack squids. And readiness includes the other activities that HSC pursues as part of its Readiness and Resiliency Initiative. We're going to turn now to a different topic and spend not a very great deal of time on one particular section of an overall emergency plan. You'll remember that an emergency is any event that is a threat to health or safety and that requires immediate action. It may be large or it may be small. The Emergency Action Plan addresses such emergencies, and it offers strategies to deal with them effectively. These are some examples. You probably have a procedure in place to respond to one or more of these. And if you gather together into one place all the policies and procedures you have to deal with emergencies, that'll go quite a ways in developing an emergency action plan. It may be helpful to distinguish between protocols, which are guidance, from procedures, which are simply sequential instructions on what to do. For example, if there's a fire, you may need to address different responsibilities of different staff in different locations. But part of the response to a fire is probably, at least sometimes, going to be evacuation. Instructions on how to evacuate should be easy to understand and easy to follow. And if you need to evacuate not because of fire, but because of a gas leak, you probably want the evacuation procedure to be exactly the same to avoid confusion. Similarly, the guidance on dealing with a bomb threat may include guidance to help responsible staff make appropriate decisions. But if it involves contacting police, you want the instructions for that to be consistent, easy to understand, easy to follow. And they probably will be the same for contacting police, whatever the reason. So now that we've talked about emergency action plans, the next step will be to complete Worksheet D. Then please watch self-study webinar number 3, which will focus on incident leadership and will also review some material on mission essential functions. When you've done that, please fill out Worksheet E before our session on April 20th. Worksheet D asks that you do two things. First, identify any policies or procedures your organization already has in place that give direction on dealing with an emergency, and make a list of them here. While you're making that list, you may find that there are gaps. You'll probably look back at the list in this webinar of typical examples of emergencies that can arise. And some of them you might feel would be appropriate for your agency. So list any kind of emergency events that you think your organization should have policies for, but doesn't yet. Thank you again for joining Human Services Council's training, Emergency Planning for Human Services Providers. If you have questions about anything that has come up in today's webinar, you can email them to info@humanservicescouncil.org. That's all one word, no hyphens, humanservicescouncil.org. The training's been available to all human services organizations, but HSC does provide other services for its members. To learn more, go to the website, or again, email info@humanservicescouncil.org. Thanks again, and I look forward to speaking with you on April 20th.